Aristotle was a student of Plato's. When Aristotle went to the academy, he was 17 and Plato was 60. He had just developed his theory of forms. Remember that theory of forms? It's that all things on the earth are pale shadows of their universal, perfect selves. Aristotle was a brilliant student, but it was a turbulent relationship between him and Plato. Plato said that Aristotle was like a foal that kicks its mother when he is born. I guess that kind of gives you the idea of the relationship between the two men. There's a famous picture of Aristotle and Plato, and it shows the two men side by side. It's a painting by Raphael. It's the central part of a much larger painting called the School of Athens. And when you look at them, you get an idea of their relationship. Plato died about 20 years after Aristotle got to the academy. Aristotle was not just a student there, but he taught there as well. And he thought, there's some indication that he thought that he would basically inherit the head teaching position at the academy, but he didn't. Plato left it to a much less brilliant relative of his. And Aristotle, in disillusionment, left Athens and went off to study nature. Now it's important to remember, Plato, with all of this abstract, mathematical kind of, universal perfect forms, I'm pointing up to this kind of like realm of the universal. It was a mathematician. Remember, he had, let no one enter here who has not first studied math, written over the entrance to the academy. Aristotle, on the other hand, was from a family of physicians who were much more interested in learning from things around them. And the story goes that that's what Aristotle does. He goes off to the beach and he is sort of looking around under rocks, picking up shells, that kind of thing. And he began to formulate an idea of the order of things. Aristotle believed that you could learn from experience. He believed that was the only way to learn things. Plato, on the other hand, believed that you were born with a certain amount of innate knowledge. Socrates too. But Aristotle did not. He thought, for example, the only way that you could understand dog was by observing dogs and making up your mind in terms of what sort of classification was related to dogs. So Aristotle takes this idea and he expands upon it. And he actually develops the first form of taxonomy. Now remember, this is a time when the line between science and philosophy is blurred. In fact, science, or biology I should say, was a long time ago, was referred to as natural philosophy and then natural history. So we begin to see, as we move through time, that there are things in philosophy, by way of knowing, they begin to formulate things that are much like our scientific method of today. Aristotle realizes that it's not important to have a theoretical realm. The reality of things can be seen on Earth. And he discovered certain constants can be found in the material world. This turns Plato on its head. It's the opposite of the allegory of the cave. And if it's true for dogs, then it must also be true for things like virtue, truth, beauty, justice. The difference between Aristotle and Plato turns out to be the difference between philosophers as we move forward through history, those that lean one way or the other. The idea of the universal perfect abstract or the learning from experience. Rationalists talk about a priori knowledge, that is, knowledge that's already contained in the individual, whereas empiricists talk about knowledge that is gained through observation, the direct observation of things. Aristotle goes on to develop a thing called the teleological argument. The teleological argument is related to this taxonomy, or the division of all things on the earth. The teleological argument is basically broken into 4 parts. Part 1 is the material cause. That is, what is a thing made of? Part 2 is the formal cause, which is what shape is the thing. Part 3 is the efficient cause, or how does it come into being in the first place? And part 4 is the final cause, which is what is the function or the purpose of a thing. So therefore, for example, the function or purpose of an eye is to see. Therefore, a good eye is an eye that sees well. You could argue that the function or purpose of a dog is to hunt in a pack. So a good dog is a dog that hunts well in a pack. Or you could argue is loyal to the master. But the important thing about it is it becomes an ethical argument when Aristotle brings in things like good and bad. Aristotle believed that a person was a good person if they pursued a life of virtue, if they used what sort of natural attributes they had to pursue a life of virtue. And the highest form of virtue was to attain wisdom in his mind. Sounds a little bit like the philosopher king of his old teacher Plato, eh? But that was how he set apart a good person from a bad person. Aristotle did another thing. He created a systematic form of logic called syllogisms. Syllogisms, the most famous one is called the Aristotelian syllogism, and it goes like this. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. It's a great way of systemizing logic, and it's fantastic if you're classifying things, but it certainly does have problems. One of my favorites is a lyric from a song which goes, ugly is bad, bad is wrong, wrong is sinful, and sin leads to eternal damnation. Well, that's not far from the logic that people used to hunt witches, or the Nazis used to persecute Jews. So you have to be careful with syllogisms. When they break down, and they can break down, they turn into fallacies and they can be dangerous. There are a couple of other things you need to know about Aristotle. After he left the academy, he became the tutor of Alexander the Great. And that was kind of a chance for him to be someone who helped guide a philosopher king. As we know, Alexander the Great later became immensely powerful. But it didn't work out. And although the relationship started out well enough, it didn't last. He didn't become this sort of paternal teacher to Alexander the Great. And in the kind of turbulent politics of Mycenae, he had to leave, eventually flee for his life, because some people thought that he was having too much influence over Alexander. As it was, Alexander was more of a kind of a athlete, I guess, than he was a philosopher. Another thing about Aristotle is that there's a story about him. It's apocryphal. It's the story of Aristotle and Phyllis. And the story, although it has different versions, basically goes like this. Aristotle is living in Mycenae, and he is smitten with this woman, Phyllis. And so Aristotle, you know, the rational, empirical philosopher, by now he's getting on a little bit in age, he's recognized as being a genius, becomes so taken with this woman that he says to her, "How can I prove my love for you?" And her answer to him is, "Let me ride you like a horse." And so there's this image of Aristotle down on all fours and Phyllis riding him like a horse. It comes out of the Middle Ages when that sort of division between Aristotelian and Platonic logic was, you know, really a case of locking horns between different views of reality. It even got mixed up with the church. Anyway, it was kind of a way of having a laugh at the sort of somber genius philosopher who would allow himself to be humiliated for the charms of a woman. And the last thing I wanted to tell you about Aristotle is that a lot of his works were lost. He wrote a lot of stuff, we know that, hundreds of works, but we only have a few, and many of them are fragmentary. And as it turns out, what happened was the works that existed in the western part of Europe, were almost completely lost, almost completely destroyed. And it wasn't until time went on and people living in that part of the world met people in the Middle East who had saved and sort of cataloged these works, that they were eventually brought back. We still know that we're missing quite a number of them, but we have enough of them to give us a picture of what Aristotle really meant about things. Again, it's the primacy of the written word.